African collections at Emory University. What I'm going to do is I'm going to read from a prepared, not statement, but something I've written about the social, political, economic context within which we have to understand the importance of studying this war, this time period. Part of it is also recognizing the fact that we're in the Centennial of the Great Migration, which is connected to this war in such a way that I think most don't recognize. And so I want to read from what I've written here so that you have a better kind of understanding of the landscape before Dr. Sammons gets into his conversation, and then Nikki, and then on to Joel Beeson. Okay? So I'll begin. The beginning of the war in Europe halted most European immigration to the United States. A labor depression in the South and a growing need for labor in the factories in the northern industrial cities further encouraged American factory owners to actively recruit black labor from the South. White agents boarded southern trains bound for Florida, Alabama, Georgia, and Tennessee to offer jobs to the willing masses, most of whom needed very little convincing to accept the opportunity to leave the South, where the brutal act of lynching was a feature of the culture and the landscape. By the winter of 1916, the Great Migration had been underway for nearly 2 years, with hundreds and then thousands of blacks moving to cities such as New York, Pittsburgh, Detroit, and Chicago, swelling their respective populations. In armament factories and meatpacking plants and as domestic labor in the homes of whites, African Americans commanded higher wages in the northern states than they would have received in the South. The opportunity to have running water, access to education, and medical care helped establish migration patterns that blacks would maintain throughout the first half of the 20th century. In turn, industries welcomed the new source of labor, which kept productivity high. Unfortunately, the employment of newly arrived blacks as competition to white American and immigrant workers and as strikebreakers in the urban steel and manufacturing industries led to several violent confrontations. Episodes such as the East St. Louis riots of 1917, which left more than 100 African Americans dead and hundreds severely injured, was a result of an escalation of prevalent racial attitudes and labor tensions. These factors, among others, represented a series of unintended consequences, many of which would have an impact on the future of blacks in America for generations. Prior to World War I, nearly 90% of all African Americans lived in the southern United States in the shadow of slavery, with most working the same lands that their forebears had toiled in as human chattel. These newly arrived transplants to the northern industrial centers helped establish a foundation for the future social, economic, and political infrastructures needed for the development of a powerful black middle class. As such, they became capable of challenging the stifling system of oppression and Jim Crow segregation responsible for impeding the advancement of the community as a whole. Shortly after the United States declared the war on Germany, the Selective Service Act was enacted on May 18, 1917. The act required men between the ages of 21 and 31, including African American men, to register with the United States government at their local recruitment stations. African American intellectuals and race advocates saw military service as the ultimate sacrifice in proof of one's citizenship and loyalty. They differed on whether African Americans should be granted equal rights as a condition for their wartime military service. And I'm going to stop there. Part of reading this was to kind of really set up this conversation at this point of, again, why it's important to revisit this history. Yes, we have a tremendous amount of ground to cover as it relates to the contributions between the 369th and 367th, 8th, 70th, all those, the different combat battalions. We also have to cover the SOS, the Soldiers of Supply, Service of Supply, and these pioneer regiments that did a tremendous amount of work in the actual war work. And so that's a history we have to recover as well. But the fact that these people, these men and women, were coming from the South, that were migrating into these places that were hostile but also receptive of their labor, we also have to cover that history. And so one of the projects that I'm interested in is to understand how transformative the war was, not in terms of just what happens in France, but what happens to families still here in the United States, and how that service in France and that migration, that time period of migration impacted their development as this kind of newly realized people. Because the war is one thing, it's something that's actualized in Europe. But the impact of that war, the intended and unintended consequences have not been fully examined yet.
When you hear those bells, it means I have to go to vote. But in part, Professor, you have to understand, when people are treated as second-class citizens and they love their country, they always feel, and our parents always taught us, you got to do a little better. You know that. Your parents told you, tell this to your kids. And so, my uncle, my grandfather came from Accomack, Virginia without an education at all. My uncle felt he had to do a little better to give credibility to his color in New York, where my grandfather couldn't do it in Virginia. Unfortunately, we continue to have to feel that we carry this responsibility. And with God's help, one day, we'll just be ordinary great Americans without feeling that we got to go to war, we got to be Tuskegee Airmen, we got to do more to prove that we deserve what the Constitution, who was not thinking about us, but was broad and expansive enough that they cannot exclude us. So you added in an eloquent academic way the feelings I had in my heart. I got to go vote. Thank you so much for being here. God bless. Good.
It's too bad that Congressman Rangel had to leave because I was going to speak about his beloved 15th New York National Guard 369 very briefly because he covered that ground very well. And I'm going to pick up on Professor McDaniels' point about World War I and basically civil rights and black activism. Is this working? Can you hear me?
I think that was the better one when Congresswoman was speaking.
Hello?
There we go.
Okay.
It's on, the green light is on.
Okay. Let me say something first about the 15th New York National Guard, which became the 369th Regiment in World War I. It was the first black National Guard unit recognized by the state of New York, and that didn't happen until 1916. And blacks in New York fought in the Civil War. There were 3 militia units from New York that were never recognized by the state of New York. And we can talk about Strom-Thurmond in South Carolina, but New York was a very southern state in many ways and had all kinds of close relationships with the South and slavery. Blacks kept pressing for membership in the militia or National Guard because they realized the status, the prestige, the sort of Americanness, claims to citizenship that they could make by being members of what we know as the citizen soldier. When we think of the citizen soldier, who do we think of most? George Washington and the Continental Army. So they kept pushing, and finally, because of legislative changes and demographic changes, and also the drumbeat of war, they were able to get their recognition, but not without tremendous struggle in 1916, but also with a great compromise. And that compromise was that the regiment had to be led by a white man. And that white man was Colonel William Hayward. And blacks were very disappointed in New York because they had seen the model of the 8th Illinois, which had been in existence since the 1890s, and it had black officers from the top down. It was an all-black unit. It was a source of envy for New Yorkers, and in some ways resentment that they were not able to get that for themselves. So as Congressman Rangel indicated, the 369th went overseas, fought with the French. 171 individuals received the Croix de Guerre. Henry Johnson received it with Palm, and in June 2nd of 2015, Henry Johnson became the second black in World War I to receive the Medal of Honor, the first being Freddie Stowers of the 371st in 1991. So those are the only two blacks from World War I to have received the Medal of Honor, and I want to talk about that at some length, because that's an issue that we need to take up in terms of recognition of the black soldier and veteran and what that lack of recognition can mean. Now let me go back to tie into what Professor McDaniels led off with here. And many of us look at World War I, and I know that Mr. Dan Dayton of the World War I Centennial Commission is really going to like this. World War I is a forgotten war. We really don't care much about World War I in America. World War II is our war. It's actually the last declared war that we won, correct? Maybe the last war, period, that we won, unless you count something like Desert Storm. So in any event, I couldn't disagree more with our ignoring of World War I. World War I was a game changer for the entire world. The map of the world that we have today is in large part, a product of World War I. World War I leads to World War II directly. All kinds of developments in medicine, but also in weapons of mass destruction come out of World War I. We have to look at the good and the bad of World War I. Many people have written World War I off for blacks, saying it was a waste. We went over there, served, died, sacrificed, and came back with nothing. In my opinion, nothing could be farther from the truth. We wouldn't have the modern civil rights movement without having World War I. Where does the new Negro come from? And I'm not necessarily talking about the new Negro intellectual or the new Negro artist. I'm talking about the mass new Negro, the street new Negro, the migrant that Pellom talks about, who's assertive, independent, is not going to go back to the status quo ante. And the soldier in World War I is a herald and in the van of the new Negro movement. Let me quote from you someone who I know Congressman Rangel knew about, if he didn't know personally, and I would think he probably knew him, and that's leading contemporary scholar during the World War I period, an activist. He was an NAACP field secretary, William Pickens. And William Pickens said that the war made clear to all, especially blacks, that character is more fundamental than reputation. And the character of black Americans shone clearly in the light of war caused by the all-exposing fires of a burning world. Suddenly, the most undesirable element in the United States became the most desirable element. And you know, when Woodrow Wilson wanted the White House to be protected, you know who he called out? He called out the DC Black National Guard Battalion to guard the White House, the most loyal of Americans. Pickens went on that the war had allowed blacks from Africa and America the opportunity to make their first great record as a modern international factor and a positive world influence. And this was a lesson that was never lost on blacks. So out of World War I came a self-confident new Negro who helped lead the long and difficult campaign for justice and equality not yet won. Now, there was a poet, songwriter, composer by the name, he went by the name of Andy Razoff, and I have trouble pronouncing his full name. He was of Martinican ancestry. He was worked very closely with Fats Waller, but was one of these new Negro intellectuals, Andy Razoff, Andreas Razbacrecko. And he wrote, as you'll see here, this is a book that I co-authored with John Morrow, which is about the 369th. We do not call them the Hellfighters. They're Harlem's Rattlers, and I'll give you a reason why through a poem by Andy Razoff called Don't Tread on Me. He also wrote a sort of riff on John McCrae's iconic In Flanders Fields. And that's more popular, and it's also illustrated by Albert Smith. I recommend that you look at that poem, In Flanders Field, Andy Razoff. But this is Don't Tread on Me, and it's an homage to the 15th New York National Guard. And it's a clarion call to the black masses. The 15th New York National Guard 369th adopted the rattlesnake as its icon in the beginning of their service in World War I, in April of World War I. And here's what Razoff wrote about the rattlesnake. There is a wondrous symbol which has come from across the sea. It's worn by every member of the 15th Infantry. A snake curled up, prepared to strike, and one can plainly see that by its threatening attitude, it says, don't tread on me. O race, make this your battle cry. Engrave it on your heart. It's time for us to do or die, to play a bolder part. For the blood you've spilled in France, you must and will be free. So from now on, let's advance with this, don't tread on me. All right? And so here we have this iconic American symbol, the rattlesnake, the Gaston flag, you know, so these African Americans adopted it, and the new Negro used it as a sort of rallying cry. I would like to end my discussion by giving you a few facts. Approximately 95 blacks in World War I received the Distinguished Service Cross, which is essentially the second highest military honor for a soldier. Not a single one during the war received a Medal of Honor, at the time called the Congressional Medal of Honor. So what's with that? Well, we have discovered that at least 8 blacks were recommended for a Medal of Honor in World War I. We know about Freddie Stowers, but also in the 371st, there was Burton Holmes. We believe that William Butler was also on that list of 8. I know that he was recommended, William Butler from Salisbury, Maryland. We know that also 4 members of the 370th Regiment, or the 8th Illinois, out of Chicago were recommended for the Medal of Honor. And in every instance in which he judged them, General John J. Pershing personally degraded those men or downgraded them to the Distinguished Service Cross. Something like 6,400 Distinguished Service Crosses were awarded in World War I, and at the time of the end of World War I, there were only 78 Medals of Honor. So we get some sense of just how special the Medal of Honor is. And one of the reasons why the cutoff line for blacks was at the Distinguished Service Cross is that all of the things that would be said disparagingly about blacks, denigrating their performance in World War I, could not have been possibly said about them had even a single black received the Medal of Honor. And I have a report here that was written in 1925 by the Army War College, and I'm going to end with this. And this is supposed to be by very intelligent men who spent 2 or 3 years writing this report on Negro manpower in the war. And here's how the document opens.